Somewhere in the Peruvian Andes, there's a wall that drinks the rain. Pour water on it during a storm, and it doesn't puddle. It doesn't streak with mud. It doesn't crumble at the edges the way 500-year-old stone should. It just disappears, pulled into a hidden network of channels, cut so precisely into the rock that engineers who study it today still argue about how it was done without a single piece of iron, without the wheel, and without anything we would recognize as written mathematics. This is Ollantaytambo, and most people who visit it only see a postcard, a staircase of green terraces climbing a mountainside, a nice photo stop on the road to Machu Picchu. What they don't see is what happens underneath their feet the moment the sky opens up. Ollantaytambo sits in Peru's Sacred Valley, about an hour and a half from Cusco by road, at roughly 2,800 meters above sea level. It was built, expanded, and used as a royal estate under the Inca Emperor Pachacuti in the 15th century, the same ruler credited with transforming Cusco and commissioning Machu Picchu. But calling Ollantaytambo a royal estate undersells it. It was a fortress, a temple complex, an agricultural laboratory, and a working town all at once, and unlike many Inca sites, it is still inhabited today. The narrow stone streets in the lower town, the ones tourists wander through on their way to the ruins, are the same streets Inca families walked 5 centuries ago, and they were laid out around the same idea that runs through the whole site. Water goes exactly where it is told to go. Start with the terraces, because they're the first thing anyone notices. From a distance, they look like enormous green steps, but each one is a piece of engineering with several jobs to do at once. The Inca called them andans, and they weren't just flat platforms held up by a stone wall. Underneath the topsoil, builders layered gravel, then coarser stone, then a foundation of larger rock, creating a filtration system that lets rainwater soak downward instead of pooling on the surface or rushing across it and stripping away the soil. On a mountainside that gets hammered by seasonal rain, that layering does 2 things simultaneously. It keeps crops from drowning, and it keeps the entire hillside from sliding away, which is exactly the kind of disaster that destroys agricultural terraces built with less care in other parts of the Andes. 500 years later, those terraces at Ollantaytambo are still farmed. Not preserved as a museum piece, still farmed, because the drainage still works. Then there's the town below, where you can still see stone-lined canals running alongside the streets, carrying water from mountain springs down through the settlement. Some of these channels feed fountains that are still functioning, including one known today as the Bath of the Princess, a carved stone basin where water pours from a spout shaped and angled with a precision that, honestly, does look strange next to everything else we associate with 15th century construction anywhere in the world. The water doesn't just fall into the basin, it's aimed, controlled, delivered at a specific rate through a specific opening, and it has been doing that, uninterrupted, since before Europeans set foot in South America. Climb higher, up past the terraces to the top of the site, and you reach the unfinished Temple of the Sun, which is really where the story gets strange. 6 enormous slabs of pink rhyolite stand in a row, each one roughly 4 meters tall and estimated to weigh in the tens of tons. They're fitted together with joints so tight that in places you genuinely cannot slip a piece of paper between them. Between the massive slabs, smaller stones act as spacers, precisely shaped blocks wedged in to lock the whole wall together, a technique the Inca used elsewhere too, essentially a stone puzzle designed to distribute stress and flex slightly rather than crack outright. This is not decorative flourish. It's structural thinking, the same instinct behind why so many Inca walls lean slightly inward, why doorways and niches are built as trapezoids rather than rectangles, why corners are rounded instead of sharp. All of it reduces stress concentration during an earthquake, and the Andes get earthquakes constantly. Cusco itself was leveled by a major quake in 1650 that destroyed most of the Spanish colonial buildings, built directly on top of Inca foundations, while the Inca stonework underneath barely moved. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you. Those 6 monoliths at the Temple of the Sun didn't come from the mountain they're standing on. The stone is rhyolite, quarried from a site called Cachacata, on the far side of the Urubamba Valley, several kilometers away and hundreds of meters higher in elevation than the temple itself. To get each block from that quarry to its final position, workers had to cut it from a cliff face, lower or lever it down the mountainside, cross a river valley that had no bridge capable of carrying that kind of weight, and haul it back up the opposite slope, all without wheeled carts, without draft animals strong enough to pull multi-ton loads, and without iron tools. Llamas, the closest thing the Inca had to a beast of burden, simply can't do this kind of hauling. So it came down to people. A lot of people, working with ramps, log rollers, fiber rope, and a level of coordinated planning that had to account for every stage of the journey in advance, because there was no room to improvise halfway across a mountain with a boulder that size. Along the actual route between the quarry and the site, you can still find evidence of that effort today. Massive stones sit abandoned in the landscape, partly shaped, clearly mid-transport, when the work simply stopped. Locals call the largest of them the Piedra Cansada, the tired stone, and it's a genuinely humbling thing to stand next to. Nobody wrote down why the work halted there. It might have been the arrival of the Spanish. It might have been the death of Pachacuti and a shift in imperial priorities. It might have been something as mundane as a broken rope or a bad rainy season. The honest answer is that we don't know. And any documentary or article that tells you otherwise with total confidence is filling in a gap with a guess dressed up as fact. Now bring the water back into the picture, because this is where Ollantaytambo stops being merely impressive and starts being genuinely strange in a way that's actually well documented. Carved into the surface of some of these massive stones, and running between the joints where blocks meet, are channels, some barely wider than a finger, that guide rainwater along deliberate paths, rather than letting it run wherever gravity happens to take it. These weren't added after the fact. The channels line up across separate stones, meaning the water path had to be designed before the individual blocks were even cut and set in place. You cannot carve a matching groove across two enormous slabs that were quarried separately, transported separately, and lifted into position separately unless someone had already worked out, in advance, exactly how those blocks would sit next to each other and where the water needed to travel once they did. That's not trial and error. That's forward planning at a level that assumes a design existed before construction began, whether that design lived on paper we've never found, in a system of knotted cords called quipu that the Inca used for record-keeping, or simply in the trained memory of master builders who had done this kind of work their whole lives. The functional result is a site-wide drainage system that operates on gravity alone. Primary channels bring fresh water in from mountain springs. Secondary channels distribute it to the terraces for irrigation. Tertiary channels carry excess water away before it can erode the stonework or saturate the ground beneath the foundations. And beneath all of that sits a layer of buried drainage that manages groundwater pressure under the massive walls, which matters enormously during an earthquake, because waterlogged soil is far more likely to liquefy and shift under seismic stress than soil that's been allowed to drain properly. In effect, the water system isn't separate from the earthquake resistance of the site. It's part of the same design. Manage the water, and you're also managing how the ground itself behaves when it shakes. Whether the Inca builders framed it in those exact terms, we can't say for certain, since they left no engineering treatise explaining their reasoning. But the physical result on the ground behaves exactly as if they understood the relationship between water, soil, and seismic stress, because the system still performs that job today, 5 centuries and countless earthquakes later, with no modern maintenance keeping it running. And then there's the moment when all of this stopped being abstract engineering and became a weapon. In January of 1537, a Spanish force under Hernando Pizarro marched into the Sacred Valley to put down a rebellion led by the Inca ruler Manco Inca, who had turned Ollantaytambo into a stronghold against the conquistadors. The Spanish had already taken Cusco. They had cavalry, steel weapons, and a track record of victories against Inca forces that, until this point, had struggled to counter mounted soldiers on open ground. Ollantaytambo was supposed to be another quick win. It wasn't. Manco Inca's forces held the high terraces and rained down stones and projectiles on the advancing Spanish column, but the detail that actually broke the assault was water. According to Spanish chronicle accounts written by soldiers who were there, the defenders opened channels that diverted the Patacancha River, flooding the valley floor beneath the fortress. Spanish horses, essential to their entire military advantage, sank into sudden marshland and became useless. The cavalry charge that had worked so effectively everywhere else in the campaign simply couldn't function in a swamp. Pizarro's forces were forced to withdraw, one of the few clear tactical defeats the Spanish suffered during the entire conquest of the Inca Empire. It's a real, chronicled event, not legend, and it only worked because the people defending Ollantaytambo understood their own water system well enough to redirect it on demand, in the middle of a battle, against an enemy they had never faced before. That's not just defensive architecture. That's applied hydraulic knowledge, used tactically, in real time. So, how does a civilization pull this off without the tools we usually associate with precision engineering? This is the honest, unresolved part of the story, and it deserves to be treated carefully rather than turned into a mystery box cliffhanger. The Inca did not have iron or steel tools. Their cutting and shaping work relied on harder stone hammerstones, along with bronze tools for finer work, abrasive sand, and enormous amounts of patient, skilled labor. They did not use the wheel for transport, likely because on steep mountain terrain, with no draft animals capable of pulling heavy-wheeled loads, a wheel offers little practical advantage over a sledge or rollers. And while the Inca didn't have a written language in the way we typically define one, they did have quipu, knotted cord systems capable of recording numerical data, and, many researchers now believe, more complex information than we've fully decoded. It's entirely possible that some of the planning for a project like Ollantaytambo lived in those cords, or in oral traditions passed between generations of master masons, traditions that were never going to be written down in a form the Spanish could read or that would survive colonization. What's genuinely remarkable, and doesn't need exaggeration to be interesting, is the scale of organized labor and institutional knowledge this required. Inca construction projects were often carried out through a labor system called amaze, a form of rotational public service, where communities across the empire contributed work to state projects instead of paying taxes and goods. A site like Ollantaytambo wasn't built by a small team of specialists working in isolation. It was built by drawing on the coordinated labor of thousands of people across an empire that stretched, at its height, from modern-day Colombia to Chile, all directed by architects and engineers whose expertise was cultivated and passed down within a highly organized state. When you think about it that way, the impossible framing starts to look less like a genuine mystery and more like a failure of imagination about what large-scale, well-organized human cooperation can actually achieve without industrial technology. The pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Stonehenge, the aqueducts of Rome, all of them raise the same basic question, and all of them have the same basic answer. Enormous numbers of skilled, coordinated people, guided by knowledge systems that didn't need to look like ours to work. That doesn't mean every question about Ollantaytambo is settled. Archaeologists do continue to debate the construction sequence of the site, including whether some of the lower, less finished stonework represents an earlier building phase, a later and less carefully executed expansion, or simply areas that were never fully completed before Pachacuty's building program was interrupted. You'll find popular theories online claiming the deepest layers of the site were built by some undocumented, more advanced civilization that predates the Inca entirely, essentially a lost, more sophisticated culture that the Incas supposedly stumbled onto and never fully understood. It's a compelling story, and to be clear about where it stands, it is not the conclusion of mainstream archaeology, and there's no solid physical or documentary evidence supporting it. What the evidence does support is a picture of Inca engineering that varied in quality across different projects and different construction phases, for the same mundane reasons construction quality varies everywhere. Different crews, different deadlines, different levels of priority assigned by the state, and in some cases, work that was simply left unfinished when circumstances changed. That's a less cinematic explanation than a vanished supercivilization, but it has the advantage of actually being supported by what we can verify. What isn't in dispute, and doesn't need any embellishment to be worth marveling at, is the functional reality of the site right now. Today, in the 21st century, the terraces still drain properly during the rainy season. The canals still carry water through the town exactly where they were designed to 500 years ago. The fountains still run. The foundations beneath the massive walls are still protected from the kind of groundwater saturation that would make them vulnerable to earthquakes. And Peru sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. No modern engineering team maintains this system. No pumps, No computer modeling keeping it in check. No annual repairs to keep the channels aligned. It simply works, the same way it was designed to work the day it was finished, because whoever engineered it understood gravity, pressure, and the behavior of water and stone well enough to build something that didn't need ongoing correction to keep functioning. That's really the story worth telling about Ollantaytambo, and it's a better one than any invented lost civilization, because it's true. A society without iron, without the wheel, and without a written language in the conventional sense, organized the labor of thousands of people to move stones, weighing as much as a loaded truck across a river valley, cut water channels into them with a level of coordination that required the entire path of that water to be planned before a single block was set in place, and built a drainage system so effective it has outlasted the empire that built it, survived catastrophic earthquakes that flattened Spanish colonial construction erected on the very same ground, and even functioned as a weapon that turned back a European invasion force with steel and horses. We don't need aliens or a phantom civilization to make that remarkable. It already is. The real mystery isn't who secretly built Ollantaytambo. It's how much of that knowledge, the practical, hard-won engineering wisdom of a civilization that never wrote it down in a form we've been able to read, simply vanished when the people who carried it in their hands and their memory were gone. Stand at Ollantaytambo during a storm, and you can still watch that lost knowledge quietly at work in the way the water disappears exactly where it's meant to go, 500 years later, waiting for someone to finally understand it, as well as the people who built it once did.